Okay, I think we got past all the technical difficulties. I think we're ready to get started. So do we have any new faces this evening that weren't here yesterday? Yes. Okay. All right, so my name is Dick Bernatchez. My wife Pat and I, she's over in the hall right now with the exhibit. We travel all over North America to various parishes, schools, religious communities, bringing what we hope are faith-building experiences. And we've been really happy to be here in your parish, yesterday with the Eucharistic miracles, and today with this sacred cloths of the Passion. Actually, in the rush trying to get ready and all the technical problems, I didn't get a chance to do something I usually like to do. So if you excuse me for just one moment, I always like to make a record of various places that I visit. And I didn't get a chance to do that earlier. I'm afraid if I don't do it now, I'll forget. It won't happen. What are you laughing at? haven't you ever done that? Taken pictures of places you visited, made a record of it? Sure. What do you call that kind of photograph? A selfie, sure. When do you think the very first selfie was taken? Do you think it was with the invention of smartphones or digital camera? Over here? The shroud, yes. Jesus came 2,000 years ago. And he left a picture of himself, right, from that time. So the very first selfie was actually created by Jesus, more than 1,800 years prior to the invention of photography. So I'd like to begin with a prayer. So if you join me in the Anima Christi, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Soul of Christ, sanctify me. Body of Christ, save me. Blood of Christ, inebriate me. Water from Christ's side, wash me. Passion of Christ, strengthen me. O good Jesus, hear me. Within thy wounds, hide me. Suffer me not to be separated from thee. From the malicious enemy, defend me. In the hour of my death, call me, and bid me come unto thee, that I may praise thee with thy saints and with thy angels forever and ever. Amen. So I do have a couple of objectives for the presentation this evening. The first is hopefully when you leave this evening, you'll be convinced that the Shroud of Turin is authentic. And by that I mean that it's not a medieval hoax, as the skeptics would have us believe. There's no way to prove that this would be the actual burial cloth of Jesus. Even if it came with a little certificate in the corner that says, I, Mary, the mother of Jesus, hereby certify, how would we know that certificate was valid, right? But I think after you hear all the information, each of us has to make our own conclusion, but I think the evidence strongly supports that it really is this burial cloth of Jesus. But the most important thing that I want you to leave with is an understanding of the immense amount of pain that Jesus endured throughout his passion for his redemption of mankind. So we're going to begin with the Shroud of Turin, which is one of the most studied and controversial artifacts in all of human history. It's an enigma, a puzzle. More than 600,000 hours have been logged by some of the best minds on the planet trying to understand this cloth. Because you see replicas that we have up here, the shroud, and the shroud itself is 14 feet long by 3.5 feet wide, or in biblical terms, 8 cubits by 2 cubits. And there's lots of different kinds of things that we see here on the shroud, but the first thing that grabs our attention when we look at it are these two parallel lines right here and right there. So that's damage that was done from a fire about 500 years ago, that we'll get into the details of it here a little bit later. And you can see two scorch lines, the dark line here, and then we can see all these really weird triangular things. Those are patches that were sewn over some holes that were burned into the shroud. So we need to eliminate all of this stuff from our view when we're looking at the shroud because it doesn't belong there. And then I'm sure you've noticed that we also have these black and white images up here. If you take a black and white photograph of the shroud, cut it in half, and then invert the colors, so all the blacks become white and the whites become black, sort of the equivalent of a negative image, except it's not an inverted image in that respect, then what you would end up with is the images that you see here. And I think you'd agree that it's much easier to see all of the features on these black and white images than it is on the natural color image of the shroud. And we'll get into the reasons for that here in a minute. Now there's water stains on the shroud. They're much more visible over here. So here's one right above the head of Jesus. Okay, so we see a water stain here in the center, and you'll see off to the sides this symmetric pattern wherever you see it in the center. There's one in the abdominal area and off to the sides, another one here in the area of the knees and off to the side. This one in the abdominal area has caused the artists throughout the ages a lot of trouble because they thought that was part of Jesus' body, the image of his body. So they were creating crucifixes and paintings of Jesus, trying to incorporate that water stain, not realizing that it was a water stain, thinking it was part of his body. So after we eliminate all of those things that are on the shroud, that gets us to what was there in the beginning, which is the faint front and back images of a scourged and crucified man. And that's what we see in the mid area here of the shroud, in this section here. And off to your left, you can see the image of the front of the body, and here, the back of the body. And of course, that corresponds to what we see here for the front and here for the back of the body. And then we have lots of blood stains that are on the cloth. So you can see all the puncture wounds and the blood that came from the crown of thorns here within the top of the head. There's blood over here in the area of the hair. There's, of course, lots of scourge marks throughout the body. We have the lance wound here and the blood that flowed out from that lance wound. We see blood dripping down the arms in this area here. See one of the exit wounds from the nail in the back of the wrist here. And, of course, the wounds in the feet over here. And then we look at the back of the head, we realize that, the crown of thorns that Jesus had was actually a cap of thorns. It covered the entire top of the head because we can see all these blood stains and blood flows at the top of the head, not just down here around the top of the ears like you see in most crucifixes. And again, of course, we see all of these scourge marks throughout the back, throughout the buttocks, the back of the legs, and of course the blood stains here on the bottom of the feet. Everybody always asks me, well, how tall was Jesus and how much did he weigh? So he would have weighed approximately 170 pounds and would have been about 5'10" in height. So that's pretty much an average guy today. But at the time of Jesus, the average Jewish man was about 5'3". So he would have stood out a head taller than his compatriots at that time. He definitely would have stood out in a crowd. But how do we get this image and blood stains on the cloth that we see? Well, after Jesus died and they took his body to the tomb, you can see how they would have laid out this 14-foot-long piece of cloth, placed his body on one half of it, then wrapped it around the top of his head, and then brought the other half of the cloth down, and then they would have tucked it in around the bottom of the feet, and then around the sides of the body in a fashion similar to the right, off to the right there in the image that you see. And then we believe at the moment of the resurrection that there was some kind of a burst of energy that took place that created the image that we see on the shroud. And the front of the body, the image got projected up and to the inside of the cloth above it, and then the back of the body, the image got projected downwards onto the inside of the cloth. So that then after the body is dematerialized, no longer there within the cloth, and later when they opened the shroud, they would have had this image of the full front and back image of the body, as well as, of course, all the blood stains that would have been transferred as a result of contact with the body itself. Of course, scripturally, it all began with Joseph of Arimathea, and he got permission to take the body, and he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth. So when it says it's a clean linen cloth, that does not mean that it came fresh from the laundry and didn't have any stains in it. It means that it met the Jewish ritual requirements, which means that it could not have been woven on a loom that had also been used for wool, because then it would have been contaminated and could not have been used as a burial shroud. Of course, the next thing we see in Scripture is after the resurrection, where Simon Peter went into the tomb and he saw the burial cloths there. Then John also went in and he saw and believed. These are very, very important words. There's only one of the apostles who was there for the crucifixion, the Apostle John. He's the only one of the apostles who would have been there as the body was prepared for burial, the Apostle John. So he knew exactly how the body was wrapped within the cloths, where it was placed in the tomb, how everything was laid out in the tomb when they sealed that tomb up with the rock. And then when he returns, he goes in and everything's identical except for one thing. The body has dematerialized and the cloth has just fallen there onto the floor of the tomb. So immediately he realizes that what he sees is what Jesus had been predicting all along, that he was going to resurrect. So he's seeing the evidence of that. Unfortunately, Peter didn't have all of that knowledge that John did, so he wasn't able to grasp that as quickly as John did. Now, I'd like you to pay particular attention to all of the information within my presentation that indicates that the shroud is something that had to have existed long before the 13th or the 14th centuries, which is what the skeptics would try to have us believe. So this is what I believe is a scriptural reference to the existence of the shroud. Because we're all familiar with St. Paul and how he's always so politically correct, right? Well, he's writing this letter to the Galatians. And he doesn't open his letter and say, well, dear friends, I hope you're doing well. He starts his letter by saying, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. He didn't say we wrote to you about his crucifixion and you read it. Didn't say we came and talked to you about his resurrection and you heard about it. It said that we showed you a picture of him crucified. So I think that means that they actually took this burial shroud of Jesus and showed it to them. Now, for the first 1,300 years of the shroud's existence, no one can say with absolute certainty where it was throughout that entire 1,300-year period. There's lots of conflicting information within the historical record. Obviously, what I'm going to be presenting is where I think it was during that time period, but I could be proven wrong tomorrow. But it really doesn't matter. The shroud could be something that was just discovered 50 years ago and completely unknown for 1,900 years. And if we had the opportunity to do the scientific study that we've done over that last 50 years, we would draw exactly the same conclusions today. We've been talking a lot about the Edessa cloth. So we call it the Shroud of Turin today because it's in Turin. So all of these cloths take on the name of the location where they happen to be. Well, the skeptics will tell you the Edessa cloth can't possibly be the Shroud of Turin because most of the historical references to the Edessa cloth indicate that it only has an image of the face of Jesus. And clearly, this Shroud of Turin has a lot more than just the face. But I've gone in the historical record and extracted instances where they were talking about the Edessa cloth and clearly indicating that it was far more than just the face of Jesus. Now, when Jesus was nearing the end of his ministry, King Abgar from Edessa wrote him a letter, and we have copies of these documents that I'm going to refer to here in the next couple of minutes within the exhibit next door. And within that letter, he said, well, I've got a small kingdom. I'm willing to share it with you. You'll be safe here from all the people who are trying to harm you. Oh, and by the way, I think I have leprosy, and it'd be really nice if you'd heal me. But Jesus sent a response back, and again, we have that scroll. And within the response, he said, well, I'm not going to come now, but one of my disciples will come later. And we have another scroll over there that's in many of the monasteries in Athos in Greece. And within that manuscripts that they have, it says that the person who came later was the disciple Thaddeus. And within the tradition of the Catholic Church, whenever we see pictures of St. Jude Thaddeus, the apostle, he's always shown carrying this image of the face of Jesus. So I believe this substantiates the fact that Thaddeus was the person who came and brought that cloth to King Abgar. Well, when he received the cloth, he touched it to his body all over, and that leprosy left his body with the exception of one spot in the middle of the forehead, and when he was baptized, that spot disappeared as well. As you can imagine, if you're King Abgar and this cloth was responsible for your healing, how devoted you would be to it, And eventually, King Abgar passed away, and anyone to whom, he passed away, and his son took over. And his son was very paganistic. And the bishop there in Edessa was concerned that perhaps the son might destroy this cloth. So what he did is he took it and he put it into a hole in the city walls and plastered over it to protect it. Well, eventually the bishop passed away, and anyone to whom he had revealed the location also passed away, so it's forgotten there within the city walls for centuries. So I'm going to go through the historical record here chronologically. So in 325, Pope Sylvester and all these bishops got together, and they established that the holy sacrifice of the Mass was to be celebrated on a cloth of linen, which is what the shroud is made of, linen, consecrated by a bishop, as if it were the clean shroud of Christ. And today we have 23 different rites within the Catholic Church, and within every one of those 23 rites, the Eucharist is celebrated on this cloth. Now, around the year 500, they published the Acts of Jude Thaddeus, and within that document, it made reference to the fact that the cloth was folded as a tetradiplon. Well, that means that it's 8 layers thick. So if you took the shroud and you fold it in half, and a second time and a third time, you can see what it would look like if folded 8 layers thick. All you would see is the face of Jesus. And off to the right there, you see a painting of Abgar receiving this cloth, responsible for his healing. Well, in 2014, when we had the International Shroud Conference, it was demonstrated that using the equipment called the VP8 image analyzer that we have on display and operational over there in the hall, that there is actually a halo around the face of Jesus that corresponds to having a cloth covering that little section of the shroud that just has the face of Jesus. So the circular cutout for the face, and then this diamond-shaped pattern cloth covering it. So they were able to detect that halo using the VP8 image analyzer, and we actually have paintings that show the cloth covered with a secondary cloth with that diamond-shaped pattern on it, with just the cutout to show the face of Jesus. So lots of evidence that would support that the shroud was actually displayed for a long period of time in such a way that all you would see would be the face of Jesus. It would explain why we have all these historical references that indicate it only has the face of Jesus. Now, in the year 544, there's a Persian army that is attacking the city of Edessa. And they've laid siege to the town. They built all their equipment to attack the town. And on the evening before the attack, the Bishop Eulalius, claimed that he had a vision of a woman more beautiful than any human woman. And that this woman told him that if he paraded the image not made by human hands, the Lord would demonstrate his wonders. Well, Bishop Eulalius says, I'm not aware of any such cloth, and if it exists, I have no idea where to find it. So she told him where it could be found within the city walls, and when they retrieved it and paraded it before the Persians, God did make his wondrous acts known, and they attributed the win over the Persians to the fact that they had paraded this cloth. So then they built a special church there in Edessa in order to house this cloth. And within the Eastern Orthodox Church, the cloth is referred to as the Mendilium. So does anybody recognize any of the people in these works of art? No? All right. How about this guy? Does anybody recognize him? I'll take that as a yes. All right. So guess what? These are the same person. However, this is what you would find in the catacombs or in the early churches when they had no idea what Jesus looked like. So each artist would create their work of art and picture Jesus the way they thought it'd be appropriate. But they really didn't know what he looked like. But just 6 years after the defeat of the Persians there in Edessa, this painting was done, And when you look at it, if you lay out a grid over the painting, it's called the Christ Pantocrator icon, Christ, ruler of the universe. You lay out that grid on the painting, lay out the same grid on the shroud, and you can see how all the image characteristics match up, side to side, up and down. But this is just one artist, of course. But many artists would do Christ Pantocrator icons, as you can see here. They're all very different. But you can look at any one of those and know immediately who you're looking at, because they all have all of these features that are based on the image that we see on the shroud. So after they rediscovered the shroud in 544, all of the artwork associated with Jesus changed, and it was all based on the image that we see on the shroud. So that's why it's so easy for us to recognize images of Jesus today. So here is a liturgical reference to the existence of the shroud. In the 6th century in Spain, on the first Saturday after Easter, what you would hear in the readings that day is that Peter ran to the tomb with John and saw the recent imprint of he who was dead and risen on the cloths. We have coins that were minted in the 7th and 9th century that have lots of characteristics associated with the shroud. So if you have two images that have a minimum of 23 points of coincidence between those two images, from a mathematical or a scientific perspective, they're thought to have come from the same source. Well, in this particular case, this coin off to the left that's called a solidus coin, it has 140 points of coincidence between the coin and the image we see on the shroud. St. John Damascene wrote this document on holy images, and within that document, he was describing the Edessa cloth as a hymation. That is a grave cloth, something that would have covered the entire body, not just something over the face. Then we have Pope Stephen III, again referring to the Edessa cloth, said that Christ spread out his entire body on a linen cloth, and it bore the glorious image of the Lord's face and the length of his entire and most noble body, divinely transferred. So he not only describes the cloth exactly as we see it today, but he also recognizes that it could not have been created by human hands. It had to be a God-made image. Now, in 944, the town of Edessa has now been under Muslim control for 300 years. It's a Christian army that's sent there to conquer the town of Edessa. Their primary objective is to try and recover this burial cloth of Jesus. They've laid siege to the town. It's about ready to fall. And the Christian general is concerned that perhaps the Muslims might destroy the cloth before they're able to recover it. So the general asks for a meeting with the Muslim emir. He says, "I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I will give you 12,000 pieces of silver. I'll release 200 Muslim captives, and I'll guarantee you one thing, perpetual immunity if you'll do one thing, and that is to turn over this cloth to us, this Mendelian." And we see in this painting in the bottom right over there, this very long cloth with the image of the face of Jesus on it being turned over to the Christian general. Well, at this point, after 900 years, the cloth leaves Edessa, and it goes to Constantinople. We can imagine if you're the bishop in Constantinople and you've received this burial cloth of Jesus, how excited you'd be. And we have a copy of the homily he delivered to his parishioners that day. And within the homily, he talked about the fact that it was a full-length burial shroud, that it had this image of Jesus on it. He talked about all of the blood stains there on the cloth, as well as the side wound that we see here on the cloth. So, I mean, it describes it exactly the way we see it today. Now, in 1192, we have what's called the Hungarian Pray manuscript. It has nothing to do with prayer. The man's name happened to be Gregory Pray. But within this manuscript is this rather interesting page of art. If you look at the top half of this page of art, you can see Jesus' body being prepared for burial. And there's a number of characteristics that we can relate back to the shroud. You can see how the arms are crossed there at the wrist, as we see here on the shroud. There are only 4 fingers visible on each hand, again, as we see on the shroud. And something that the artists would never have done at this time, they were considered to be blasphemous. They drew Jesus naked, yet Jesus is naked there within the shroud. So they're just being true to what they saw on the shroud. Now, in the bottom half of the page of the art, you see where the woman come after the resurrection, and they want to finish the preparation of the body, and Jesus' body is gone. They see this angel. They say, well, where is he? And he points at this empty burial shroud. And you can see how it's folded in half there, and you can see the top part is the outside of the shroud, and the bottom half is the inside of the shroud, and how it has all these little red crosses on there. We believe that those red crosses correspond to areas that had blood on the shroud, and of course there is lots of blood there on the shroud. Now I'm going to enlarge section, okay? So if you take an enlargement of a photograph of the weave of the cloth on the shroud, you're going to see that it's not a normal weave. You know, normal weaves, you go over one thread under one, over one, under one. But this is what's a 3/1 weaving pattern. So it's called herringbone or twill today. And if you look at the drawing right above it, you can see that they have captured that 3/1 weaving pattern within the drawing. Now I'm going to take all of the section in the yellow rectangle there and enlarge that. And you'll notice there's these little circles that have been drawn. Well, if we look at the shroud, right here you can see an L, okay, laying on its side. And here's the mirror image of that L. Okay, so we have these two L-shaped burn patterns here. They actually exist over here as well, but they were further down into the cloth at the time of this event, so they're rather superficial relative to these two L patterns. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those two L-shaped patterns and project them onto the cloth here and highlight the little circles that are drawn within the artwork, and you can see how those two L-shaped burn patterns correspond to where they drew those circles within this art. So, it's kind of, you can't really debate the fact whether or not the shroud was used to do this. It's impossible that they would have drawn these circles in the places that correspond to where we see these burn holes on the shroud. 1204, we have what's called the sack of Constantinople. And the shroud disappears again, this time for 145 years. So it was a letter that was sent to Pope Innocent III a year after the sack of Constantinople, and within that letter it said that the Venetians that were part of the conquering army had taken all the precious metals, gold and silver, and all the jewels, but that the French knights had taken all of the relics, and the most precious of all being the burial cloth of Jesus. So from that letter, we're led to believe that the French knights had this burial cloth of Jesus. And 145 years later, we have a French knight by the name of Geoffrey de Charnay, who is known to possess the shroud. And from this point in time to today, we've known exactly where the shroud has been. Now, personally, I think that during that 145-year period, that the Knights Templar had the shroud, because in 2009, there was a Vatican archivist that found a document created by a gentleman by the name of Arnaud Sabatier. And he described in that document being initiated into the Knights Templar and how he was required to kiss the feet of this image 3 times. So that's where I believe the shroud was during that time period and how it was being used. However, to give you an idea how much confusion there is among the shroud historians, at the 2017 International Shroud Conference, there were 16 different theories presented on where the shroud was during that time period. In 1532, the shroud is in Chambray in France. There's the picture of the church. It's within the silver reliquary. It's placed within a niche of the church wall, covered with an iron grate, 4 locks, 1 in each corner, 4 different keys required to open those locks. There's a fire in the church, and the fire is getting closer and closer to where the shroud is, but they can't retrieve the 4 keys in order to be able to rescue it. So the flames continue to get closer to the shroud to the point where they created these 2 scorch lines that you see here. And then some of that silver from that silver reliquary started to melt, and a drop of it fell onto the cloth, and it went through every layer from top to bottom, burning a hole through the shroud. And then the poor Clare nuns came along and they sewed all these patches over the holes that had been burned there. In 1578 is when the shroud actually arrives in Turin. And this is St. John the Baptist Church, which is where you'll go if you go to Turin to be in the presence of the shroud. It's at that church. In 1898, we have the intersection of science and history. The gentleman that you see here off to the left is Secondo Pia. So he was an attorney by trade, but he had photography as a hobby. And the shroud was out for public exposition. And after everyone had left for the day, he got permission to take the very first photograph of the shroud. And he used the camera that you see there in the bottom section. And you can see how huge that camera is. And the technology of photography has changed a lot since 1898 to today. You know, today we take out our cell phones and we point it at something, push a button, and boom. What we see is exactly what we were looking at in full color. Well, back then, in order to take a photograph, you had to take a piece of glass, treat it with chemicals, and do that in a dark room, put that into your camera while it was in the dark, then haul that off to wherever you can take the photograph, you know, sit your hourglass, take the cap off the lens, and then eventually put it back on, haul it all back to your laboratory, take that piece of glass out in the dark room, and then you'd have to run it through another chemical bath. And every once in a while, you hold it up to a red light to see if the image has started to appear. And Secondo said that when the image did start to appear, he just about dropped it, because what he saw is what you see on the screen there. And being a photographer, he was accustomed to the fact that the image that showed up on the glass would be a negative image, and that it would look very strange relative to what he took the photograph of. Yet when he looked at that, he says, well, that's a very natural appearing image. So therefore, the image that we have on the shroud has to be a negative image, and it's only when you create a negative of the negative that you end up with something that looks natural. Does anybody recognize this famous comedian? No. All right, how about if I give you some help? All right, so I've taken this photograph of Father, made a black and white photograph from it, and then created a negative image from that black and white image. So this image that you see off to the left is basically the type of image that we see on the shroud. So if I just overlay those images on the shroud, and if we're going to take a photograph of what we have off to the left, the negative image is what we would see in the middle, and then when you shine light through that negative onto some photographic paper, you get the print that you see off to the right. Well, if you look at the features of let's say, the print of Father relative to the negative image of the shroud, like pay attention to the eyes, for example. You know, normally when you look at a person, their eyes are in shadow because they're recessed, and you can see how you have that dark area around the shrouds on the negative image as in the print of Father. And if you look at the negative image of Father, how it compares quite favorably with the print that we have of the shroud itself. 1978 is when they did the Shroud of Turin research project. And most everything we know scientifically about the shroud today was either directly or indirectly related to this STIRP project in 1978. 1988 is when they did the radiocarbon dating. This was a very, very dark day for the shroud, because when they came out, the results, it said the shroud was something that came into existence sometime during the 13th or the 14th centuries. Well, I think I've given you lots of data that indicates the shroud had to have existed long before the 13th century. We'll find out in a few minutes why the radiocarbon dating was wrong. 1997, we have an arsonist who attempted to destroy the shroud by trying to burn down the church. And at this point in time, it was kept within this bulletproof glass reliquary space, and when they had the fire there in the church, this heroic firefighter came in with his sledgehammer, and he just kept hammering and hammering and hammering on that glass until he was finally able to break through, and they were able to rescue the shroud, or else it might not even exist today. In 2002, the folks in Turin decided to do a restoration on the shroud. So they took off all the patches that we talked about, the 32 patches here on the shroud. They scraped all of the scorched threads, okay, all of these dark colored threads, so they scraped those all away. They vacuumed every square inch of the shroud to suck out any material that they could extract from it. They treated it with special chemicals to help prevent future bacterial attack. And they said, well, while we're at it, we have all these wrinkles all over on the shroud. You can see them here, here, here. There's lots and lots of wrinkles on the shroud. So they said, well, it's going to look a lot prettier if we stretch it and pull out those wrinkles. So they did that as well. So I guess if you ask me today, based on the new images of the shroud, how tall Jesus was, I might have to tell you he's an inch or two taller than what I told you earlier. When the shroud scientists found out what had been done to the shroud as a result of this restoration, they threw up their hands in disgust. They said, we can't believe what you have done to the shroud that's going to impact our ability to do future research on the shroud. But the folks in Turin, they had a great explanation. When they came out with their initial press release, they said, we are going to make millions of euros by selling photographs of the newly restored shroud. So 2025 is the next opportunity that you'll have to actually go to Turin and to be there in the presence of the shroud and be able to see it. So they have not announced what the dates are, but I'm sure there'll be lots and lots of tours available, and you may very well want to pay attention to the news and all, because it should be very well publicized. So what I'd like to do now is to look at the scientific study. We want to look at the confirmed observations. In other words, where multiple scientists have done the same series of tests and come up with the same conclusions, not just one person. We're going to look at the challenge authenticity, that being the carbon-14 test. And really what's most important to us is, does this cloth correspond to what we know Jesus went through based on Scripture? So we're going to start out by looking at the chemical and physical characteristics. Well, you can see an enlargement of a couple of the threads woven into the cloth here, this linen cloth. And in order to get linen cloth, you have to have these linen threads. In order to get linen threads, you start with a flax plant, and you take these tiny fibers of flax, and you twist like 70 to 200 of these together to make an individual thread. Well, you notice that if you look at the threads that are visible there, that the top one has a lot of area that has this characteristic yellow color that causes the image we see on the shroud, whereas the thread below it, about 2/3 of it is just clear. It does not have that yellow discoloration. All of the threads that are on the shroud that have image information are exactly the same color. If you say, well, gee, some parts of the image are dark, some of it are light or whatever, that's only because if you put those fibers that have image information close together, then the image looks dark. And as you start to provide some space or gaps between those image threads, the image looks lighter and lighter, but they're all identical. And if you look at the individual fibers that do have image information, it's only the outside circumference of the fiber that has this yellow discoloration, and it's only to a depth of 28 millionths of an inch. So it's very, very superficial. And as I've shown off to the right there, it's only the top 1 or 2 fibers on the crown of the thread, the part that's visible, that can have image information. That image information does not penetrate down into the depth of the thread or the cloth itself. This next fact is particularly important. If you think about an artist trying to create this work of art, he would start out by making some kind of an outline of the image he was going to create, and then he'd fill in all the details, and then after he got it completed, he would then say, well, gee, in order to make it look like it's an authentic crucifixion scene, I need to add some blood in various places. So he might get some pig blood or chicken blood or something like that, and he would start dabbing blood on different places to make it look authentic. Well, when they were doing the Shroud of Turin research project, they discovered that there was no image underneath the blood that was on the shroud. So, that validates what we know. Of course, Jesus' body after he died would have been placed in contact with the cloth, the blood would have transferred, and then at the moment of the resurrection, some kind of event causes the image we see there, and the blood kept that image information from being imprinted on the cloth. So we can understand why there's no image under the blood stains, whereas the skeptics who want us to think that they've that this was a work of art, there's no way you'd start with the blood stains and then come back later and try and create the image afterwards. So if you think that the image that we see here on the cloth is somehow related to a chemical reaction between the body and the cloth itself, you'd expect it to be quite different for the skin versus the hair, yet it's essentially identical. And if you think about the fact that for the front, well, let's say for the back image here, we have the entire weight of Jesus' body against the cloth, yet for the front image, all we have is the weight of the cloth. So you expect, again, that the images might be quite different between front and back, but they're virtually identical. So I'd like to take you on a little adventure. But I need someone to help lead this adventure. So all of you who have experience as grave robbers, would you please raise your hands? No grave robbers this evening. Okay. A few months ago, I asked that question. A gentleman in the front row had been taking copious notes throughout the presentation, and his hand shot up. And I looked at him and I said, "Are you sure you understood the question?" He said, "Yes, I'm an archaeologist." Okay, so what we are going to do is we are going to go and steal Jesus' body from the tomb. Are you ready? All right, so we head out in the middle of the night, and we're approaching the tomb, and as we get close, we realize there's something there that's going to cause us some difficulty. And what is that? The soldiers, right, the soldiers. And why are they there? Because there was this rumor that Jesus was going to resurrect, and they wanted to make sure that Jesus' disciples didn't come and steal his body so that they could say, "Aha, see, we told you he was going to resurrect." So they have one purpose in life, right, this evening, right? And that's to make sure that we don't come and steal that body. But somehow we have to get them out of the way. I don't know if we club them over the head, get them drunk, bribe them. But what do you think is going to happen to those soldiers if we succeed in getting them out of the way? They're probably going to lose their heads, right? Okay, so we finally dispose of the soldiers, and then what do we encounter? The stone, right? Okay, so it's the middle of the night. We start pushing that stone out of the way. We're making all kinds of noise. What if someone comes running to investigate to find out what's causing all that noise? And they catch us trying to steal Jesus' body. What's going to happen to us? We're probably going to lose our heads, right? Okay, so we finally get that stone moved out of the way. We run into the tomb, and there's Jesus' body. I don't know about you, but at this point, I'd have an awful lot of anxiety that I would want to grab that body and run off with it as quickly as possible. But we know from Scripture that the cloth, the burial shroud, was left behind. So that means that what we're going to do, this burial shroud is now glued to Jesus' body. All the blood, all the sweat have dried. So we're now going to kneel down and we're going to start peeling this burial shroud away from Jesus' body until we get it peeled off the front of his body. We're going to flip the body over and then start peeling it off the back of the body. And then when we get just the naked body of Jesus left, then we're going to pick that up and run off with it. Well, I don't know about you, but I think that's rather preposterous. But when they were doing this Shroud of Turin research project, they said, well, we need to test that hypothesis because we see that in Scripture. So they checked all over the shroud looking for evidence of these torn fibers that would be associated with trying to pull this cloth away from his body. All of these little tiny flax fibers, and they could find no evidence of that. Now, this is another very simple test that they did as part of the STIRP project in 1978. They said, well, if there's anything on the cloth that's causing the image that we see there, all we really need to do is to find an area with a lot of contrast. So they said, well, the area with the most contrast was here around the face. Take a bright light and put it behind the cloth, right behind the face there, and shine it through, and you and I can look at that and see that there's nothing there that corresponds to the image that we see on the shroud for the face of Jesus. We can see, of course, some of the blood stains that are there, but nothing that corresponds to that image. And of course, they did all kinds of tests with state-of-the-art sophisticated equipment in terms of microscopic, chemical, spectroscopic, all kinds of tests, and they could find no evidence of anything on the cloth that was causing the image that we see there. Now, in iconography, Jesus is often depicted with very, very long fingers. Look at how long those fingers are. You ever seen anybody with fingers that long? I've seen some women with some pretty long fingernails, but I've never seen fingers like that. Well, why would that be? Well, if we look at the shroud, Jesus is shown with very, very long fingers. And why is that? Well, if we think about the anatomy of the human hand, we think that our finger bones end when we get to the palm of the hand. But in reality, the finger bones extend all the way down to the wrist. So what we're seeing on the shroud is the entire length of Jesus' finger bones from the tip of the finger all the way down to the wrist. Well, what technology do we use today in order to image bones? X-rays, right? So this gives us a really good clue of what kind of burst of energy might be associated with the image that we see on the cloth. It might be something very similar to an X-ray. Now, I have some rather graphic images throughout the presentation here. What happened is the folks in Seville in Spain decided they wanted to make a crucifix that was as authentic as possible. So they got together with the shroud scientists, and they said, we want to incorporate all the wounds that are visible on the shroud into this crucifix. So they did that. So this is probably the most authentic crucifix you'll find anywhere, and it's in Cordova in Spain. This next fact is incredibly important. When we have a homicide today, and the people from the medical examiner's office shows up, and they start to do their CSI kind of job, what's the first thing they try to establish relative to that dead body? The time of death. And how do they do that? They have a well-defined timeline of what happens minute by minute, hour by hour, and day by day after a person dies. Right? Okay, so anyone from the medical examiner's office can come in, they can look at this cloth, and they can tell you immediately whoever was buried within this cloth could not have been there for more than 2 to 3 days, because within 2 to 3 days, putrefaction begins, the decaying of the body, and if that had started, there'd be evidence of it on the cloth. Well, why would they bury someone within their burial shroud and that body not be there 2 to 3 days later? I think we all know the answer to that question, don't we? So scientists studying the shroud today, most of their efforts have been focused on trying to reproduce the image, to try and come up with a technique that would generate image characteristics that match the image that we see on the shroud. And all their efforts to date have failed. So today the scientists have a database of soil samples from throughout the planet. So if you bring dirt into them and they do a spectroscopic analysis of it, they can go into that database and they can pretty well tell you where that soil actually came from. Well, when they look at the shroud, they found soil samples around the feet, the nose, and the left knee that just happen to be a very rare travertine aragonite material that comes from Jerusalem. So think about our artist over in medieval Europe creating this work of art. And he says, I've done this wonderful work of art here, but, someday in the future, they might be able to tell the difference between the dirt I'm standing on and dirt that comes from Jerusalem. So they're going to take their assistant and send them over to Jerusalem to collect some dirt so they can bring it over and rub it onto the cloth in different areas to make it look authentic, right? Oh, and by the way, that assistant, when he's over there in Jerusalem collecting dirt, he also needs to collect pollens. Now, it may be pretty difficult to see and collect those pollens, but, got to do that because we have to spread pollens all over the cloth to make it look like it came from Jerusalem. And we not only want you to find pollens that are current, we want you to find pollens that have been extinct for a couple of centuries, because we need to spread those on the cloth as well. Well, I wouldn't want to be that assistant tasked with having to bring back those things from Jerusalem. So if you think that the image that we see on the cloth is somehow related to physical contact between the body and the cloth, we can tell that, of course, the shroud would have been in contact with the tip of the forehead, the nose, the chin, the chest. But there have been lots of areas, as you can see in the drawings there, that would not have had contact with the body, but that did not impact the ability for the image that we see there on the cloth. The scourging. There are 159 scourge marks on the front of the body and 213 scourge marks on the back of the body. If you examine the scourge marks, you're going to see we have this repeating pattern of two circles joined by a straight line. Two circles joined by a straight line. You see this pattern repeating over and over throughout the entire shroud. So we know from examining the shroud that he had to have been whipped with some kind of a whip that had this dumbbell shape configuration. And it's only in recent excavations that they found Roman whips that had that dumbbell shaped configuration at the end. And some of them would be made out of metal and some would be made out of bone. But what the Romans would do is, regardless of what the material was, they would take files and they would file sharp edges within those balls. And during the whipping, those balls would penetrate into the flesh. And then when they pulled the whip back, would tear the flesh anywhere that those balls had penetrated. And when they examined the actual scourge pattern there on the shroud, they were able to determine that he had to have been whipped by two different people of different heights here, with this guy being considerably taller than the guy on the right, to create that pattern. Today we have some rather sophisticated computer programs for analyzing graphics. Now, if you take any normal photograph and you submit it to the computer and you say, show me where the edges of the image are, it'll come back and say, well, here's the shape of the head, here's where the eyes are, here's the edges of the arms and legs and all that good stuff. But when they do it with the shroud image, the computer comes back and says, well, I can find where all the patches are, I can find water stains, I can find all the creases, all these burn marks, but I cannot find anything on the cloth that corresponds to the image that we see there. So we talked about the fact that the image on the shroud is a negative image, but it's also a 3D encoded image based on brightness and darkness. And they're able to demonstrate that using this VP8 image analyzer, as you see in the photograph there, and we have one that's operational, and we can show you how to use it here after the presentation that's over there in the hall. So if you assume for a moment that the image that you see in the upper left-hand corner here is popping out of the screen towards you, and we have light coming in from the top of the screen, whatever the light encounters first is going to be very bright, and anything below it will be in shadow. So I'm going to take that image and rotate it, and you'll see how the shadows shift from one side to the other because of that 3D characteristic. And again, when we go over to the VP8 image analyzer, you'll actually be able to rotate the knob, rotate the image, tilt it down, and see exactly how it just pops right out of the cloth. When they made that discovery, they then took photographs out of their wallets of their loved ones and put it in front of the camera, but it did not have this natural 3D appearance. They then went to the libraries, burned in the art history books, and again, they put pictures like from Raphael, Michelangelo, all the famous artists, but they did not have this natural 3D appearance of the shroud. So they then were able to take this equipment over to Turin in Italy and show it to the people who had responsibility for the shroud. And as a result of being able to show them this 3D characteristic, they then got permission to do the STIRP project that they did in 1978. So if it hadn't been for this equipment, all that scientific study that was done then may not have even happened. But what we're looking at here is 50-year-old technology. If you apply current state-of-the-art technology to the 3D information encoded on the shroud, this is what you end up with. So look at the incredible detail there that we have of the 3D image of the entire body of Jesus and the face itself. So everybody knows that Jesus died from crucifixion, right? But what would have caused the moment of death? It would have actually been from cardiogenic or hypothalamic shock, which basically means that because of all the loss of blood throughout his passion, he would have had insufficient circulation to meet the metabolic needs of the vital organs, a lack of oxygen, a lack of nutrients, and ultimately the body would have gone into shock and he would have died. Cicero referred to crucifixion as the most cruel and atrocious of all punishments. And perhaps some of you have had a spouse or a dad maybe hit their thumb with a hammer and start screaming, "Oh, I'm in excruciating pain." Well, the word excruciating actually means from the cross. And it's highly unlikely that any of us have experienced the level of pain that Jesus was enduring there during his crucifixion. Because those nails piercing his hands and his feet would have penetrated nerves, and that causes pain that is so severe that even morphine would not reduce the level of pain. Yet that's what we use for us soldiers that are wounded on the battlefield, but it would not have helped Jesus. So how was Jesus actually nailed to the cross? Well, up until about 75 years ago, we all know the answer to that. We can look at any crucifix and see that he was just nailed right there through the palm of his hands onto these 4x6s that they bought at Home Depot, right? Okay, well, it was a Dr. Barbet wrote a book called A Doctor at Calvary. And that became the Bible that people like myself that would go out and do presentations on the shroud use, because that was the most, authoritative document of what a medical person thought actually happened to Jesus. And Dr. Barbet said, well, Jesus couldn't have been nailed through the palm of the hands because it would not have been sufficiently strong to support the body. As I showed, there's only this little tiny web of skin between the finger bones, and the nails would have just torn out that flesh very simply. It not only would not have been able to support the body, it wouldn't even be able to support an arm. So Dr. Barbet came up with the theory that, well, he had to have been nailed through the wrist. And he identified this spot on the back of the wrist that would have been sufficiently strong to support the body. Now we have this other doctor, Dr. Zugabe in New York, chief medical examiner for one of the counties there, done tens of thousands of autopsies. And he had a real problem with what Dr. Barbet said, because he said, well, if Dr. Barbet is right, there's a real problem, because the blood stain associated with where he's saying he was nailed to the cross of the wrist does not correspond to where we see the blood stain on the shroud. So he said there has to be another explanation. So one day he had this woman who was defending herself from a knife attack, put her hand up in defense, and the knife went into the palm of the hand and came out through the wrist. And he looked at that and he said, well, that must be how Jesus was actually nailed to the cross. So you can see here the needle that went through that path and went into the palm of the hand and came out through the wrist. And it misses all the arteries, so you don't bleed out quickly. There are no bones that are broken. It's sufficiently strong to support the body, and it matches the location of where we see the blood stain on the shroud. And not only that, this is Therese Neumann. She fasted for 36 years on nothing but the Eucharist. Every single Friday, she would relive our Lord's Passion. And these stigmata wounds would bleed profusely, and her garments would be soaked in blood. And you can look here, and you can see that she has the entry wounds here in the palm of her hand, and the exit wound there in the back of the wrist. So everything matches up. So this is how I believe Jesus would have been nailed to the cross, diagonally through the palm of the hand and out through the wrist. So the blood and the bodily fluids did exactly what you'd expect to do. The blood that's there in the shroud is type AB. There's blood from both arteries and veins that are present. The blood migrated through the cloth by capillary action. But when you look at the photograph there, you can see that the blood is still red. Well, Barry Schwartz, who was the documentary photographer on the STIRT project in 1978, for 18 years he could not believe in the authenticity of the shroud. And he said there was one thing that was holding him back, and that was the fact that the blood was still red. Because everybody knows that blood quickly turns to a really dark color. Well, this Jewish doctor, a Dr. Adler, happened to hear Barry expressing this concern one day. He said, well, Barry, I can tell you exactly why the blood is still red. If a person undergoes a severe amount of trauma, that causes the chemistry of the blood to change. And if you elevate the bilirubin levels within the blood chemistry, that'll cause the blood to stay red indefinitely. So Barry became an instant believer in the authenticity of the shroud and has dedicated the last 27 years of his life to the study of the shroud.
The pollen analysis that they did was able to confirm the historical journey associated with the shroud and also confirm that it had to have been present there in Jerusalem. So after 3 years of analyzing their data, the STIRP team came up with their final report in 1981. And in that report they said, the image is an ongoing mystery, and the problem remains unsolved. And here we are 42 years later, and that statement is as true today as it was in 81. The image is an ongoing mystery. The problem remains unsolved. Radiocarbon dating. When they came out with their report, they said the shroud was something that came into existence sometime between 1260 and 1390. Well, I have a hard time reconciling with that, with all the information we've been discussing here. So what was wrong with the radiocarbon dating? Well, Barry Schwartz, that documentary photographer on the STIRP project, happened to be on the phone one day with Ray Rogers. Ray Rogers was the chief chemist on the STIRP team. They used to call him Six-Gun Ray, because whenever any of the scientists on the STIRP project would come up with a theory about the shroud, Ray would shoot him down. So Ray's on the phone one day with Barry, and Barry says, have you heard this rumor, or this theory rather, that Benford and Marino have come up with? They think that the reason the carbon-14 dating is wrong is because it was done on an area of the shroud that had an invisible repair. Well, Ray Rogers says, that's ridiculous. I can prove him wrong in just a few hours. Well, Barry says, well, go ahead and do it. A few hours later, the phone rings, and Ray's calling Barry back. He says, guess what? They're right. So he had access to some of the threads from the shroud in the area where the carbon-14 testing had been done. And he was able to detect a number of things. First of all, we talked about the fact that the shroud had to be this clean cloth. No, just linen. Well, in the area of the carbon-14 test, they were able to find that there was a mixture of linen and cotton. Not only that, the fibers or the threads in this area of the shroud have double the density, the weight per length, of threads that were taken from other areas of the shroud. Well, why would cotton be mixed in with the material? It's patched, okay? All right, so if you're going to do an invisible repair, you need to be able to dye it so it matches the adjacent material, right? Well, linen is difficult to dye, but cotton is very easy to dye. And here we can actually see this mordant dye that's on these fibers here that help make it blend in with the adjacent material. And this thread that you often see down here in the bottom left-hand corner is actually a splice between cotton and linen. Now off to the right, you see that orange picture. That's called a quad mosaic. And what the quad mosaic was designed to do is to detect any chemical differences on the cloth. If there's a difference in color, that means the chemistry is different. It won't tell you what the chemistry is, just that it's different. Well, if you look at the main body of the shroud, you see it has this characteristic orange color. The white rectangle I drew on there is the area that corresponds to where the carbon-14 testing was done. Well, you can see that the orange color extends into this rectangular area at a diagonal. So to the right of this diagonal, you have the orange, and to the left of the diagonal, you have this dark green color. So that's an indication that there's probably a difference in the chemistry from one side of the carbon-14 sample to the other. And I've drawn that diagonal line here over the outline of the carbon-14 sample that was extracted from the shroud, and the samples that were provided to Oxford and Zurich and Arizona for testing that were right beside each other there. And if you see the diagonal line going through there, you can see how there'd be a different mixture of material on the right that could be original material, and material on the left that could be this patch. And you'd expect, because they're so close together, those three samples, that the laboratories would have come up with almost identical results. But when we look at the results of their testing, there's a 100-year jump from one sample to the other, which you can pretty well predict from that diagonal line going through those samples. Well, in 2013, Dr. Gugliofanti got together with 6 international laboratories, and they said, well, we need to find other techniques to try and date the shroud, because there's obviously a problem with the carbon-14 test. So I drew this timeline on here from 1000 BC out to 1500 AD, and this is the carbon-14 test of 1260 to 1390. So here's an expanded name of the 3 tests that they used, just the abbreviated names here. If you look at the midpoint of each of these little areas that are highlighted here in green, that would be the best guess date associated with that particular test, and the minimum and maximum dates associated with each test represent the width of that green area. Well, if you look at the 3 tests and say, well, where's the area of overlap among the 3 tests? It's in the time period from 0 to 100 AD, which is exactly the time period we'd expect it to be. And then when they combined the 3 sets of data into one data set, they came up with 33 BC plus or minus 250 years. Again, right where we would expect it. Now, just last year, the National Laboratory of Italy used another technique for trying to date the shroud called wide-angle X-ray scattering. And using that technique, they were able to determine that the shroud had to be somewhere between 1900 and 2100 years old. Again, right in the time period we'd expect it to be. This is the best that the scientists have been able to come up with so far. If they take 16 million watts of energy and concentrate it on 1 little square centimeter of some linen material, not the shroud, some linen material, they can get those fibers to take on the same characteristics as the fibers that are on the shroud that cause the image that we see there. So 16 million watts of energy for 12 billionths of a second. They cannot create an image using this technique, but they can get the fibers to take on that same characteristic yellow color on the outside. No damage done to the inside of the fibers. They maintain their clear color on the inside. So to put things in perspective, has anybody ever heard of the Dallas Cowboys? Yes, okay. How about the Dallas Cowboys Stadium? Okay, if you were to light every single light bulb in the Dallas Cowboys Stadium, it would require 3/4 of a billion watts of energy to do that. Well, if you take this 16 million watts per square centimeter over the area of the image on the shroud, it would require between 4 and 8 billion watts of energy to create that image. Where would they get that kind of an energy source? Not only that, in order to do that, it requires a special type of laser called an excimer laser. And there aren't enough excimer lasers on the entire face of the planet today to accomplish that task. So I think about this. It reminds me of Corinthians, where we find, listen, I will tell you a mystery. We will all be changed in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. So I think that flash, that twinkling of an eye, corresponds to that 12 billionths of a second. That's the best that the scientists have been able to come up with so far. So if you look at the photograph off to the left here, this is an unfertilized human egg. And at the exact moment of conception, we have this burst of energy that takes place. I'm going to show you a 5-second video of mouse eggs in a Petri dish being fertilized. Watch this. So this is what happens at the beginning of life. We have this burst of energy that takes place, and now we see all this evidence that at the moment of the resurrection, there's this huge burst of energy that takes place. So what I'd like to do now is switch to the analogies of what we see in Scripture to what we see on this cloth. Of course, Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and we see all the evidence throughout the front and back of the body of the scourging. Having made a crown of thorns, they placed it on his head. Here we see all these puncture marks here, throughout the back of the head, the top of the head, the front of the head, from that crown of thorns. They didn't break his legs. This man in the shroud had no broken bones. But one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. And we see the lance wound here and the blood that flowed out from it. And using X-ray fluorescence testing, they were able to detect the edema fluid that came out with that blood around the periphery there of the blood stain. So the edema fluid would correspond to what they call blood and water. You know, if I were to see edema fluid, I would describe it as water. So if we go to the prophecy of Isaiah, what we find is from the bottom of the feet to the top of the head, nothing is left sound, only lacerations, contusions, and open wounds. I'd like to now switch to the Sudarium of Oviedo, and I have a replica of that here to the right. So this is very, very different than the shroud. The shroud, like I said, is a very expensive, very unusual cloth. The Sudarium is basically just a rag. It's 34 inches by 21 inches in size. There's no image on it. It's just stained and dirty and wrinkled. But we see it referred to in Scripture in the Gospel of John, where Simon Peter went into the tomb and saw the linen cloth lying on the ground, that being the shroud, and also the cloth that had been over his head. So that's the cloth we talk about now. The Sudarium is the cloth that was over his head. We have a well-defined history on this, going all the way back to the time that Peter had it. And we know it's been in the town of Oviedo ever since the city was founded in 761, and for 50 years prior to the founding of the city, it was in a cave just 6 miles away. So again, if we can establish a link between the Sudarium and the shroud, it gives additional evidence of the authenticity of the shroud. Now in 850, the bishops got together and created a commentary on the Gospels. And within that commentary, they said that Peter would wear this cloth on his head in the rite known as the imposition of hands, through which he was able to obtain miraculous cures. So Peter would wear the Sudarium. Later, bishops wore turbans, and today the mitre. So we believe the basis of the mitre goes all the way back to Peter wearing the Sudarium on his head. And of course, we see in the Acts of the Apostles how when Peter would walk through the town, people would take their loved ones and put them in the street, so his shadow would cast over them. Well, the streets back then were their sewer system. So if you're going to take your loved ones and put them in the sewer, you've got to have a lot of confidence that something really wonderful is about to happen. And it may very well be that when Peter was walking through and his shadow was casting over these people, that he was actually wearing this Sudarium on his head. So the folks in Spain said, well, the Americans did this wonderful study on the Shroud of Turin. We have this cloth here in Spain. We ought to put together a team from forensic biology and criminology to study it and see what we can learn about it. So they did that. And when they studied the pollens, the pollen analysis conformed perfectly to the historical path associated with this cloth. When they studied the stains, they said, well, this cloth covered a deceased adult male who had a beard, a mustache, and long hair that was tied at the back of the head. And it had 1 hour-old vital blood from a series of small puncture wounds. And that the vital blood covered the head, the neck, the shoulders, and the back, and it's human blood type AB. And it was a mixture of 1 part blood and 6 parts edema fluid, the same mixture that they estimated was here on the shroud itself. So this cloth was placed over Jesus' head after he had died, but was still on the cross. The scientists say the man was mistreated and later crucified. So I guess mistreated is a scientific term for Jesus' passion, all the things he endured leading up to his crucifixion. At the time this cloth was placed on his head was 70 degrees forward, 20 degrees to the right, and it was up against his arm. So when they wrapped the cloth around his head, his arm was in the way, so they had to wrap it back around the front. The body had to be suspended in this position for an hour, with the arms in the form of a cross and the feet fastened. At the end of the hour, they were then able to take the body down from the shroud, from the cross, And now they move the arm out of the way, and they retie the cloth around his head, and this time they put a knot in it in order to hold it in place so it wouldn't fall off. And they then carry the body from the foot of the cross to the tomb, a 5 to 10 minute journey, face down, with someone supporting the head with their left hand, pinching the nostrils between their thumb and forefinger as they made that 5 to 10 minute journey to the tomb. When they arrived at the tomb, the body was then flipped over onto its back. The sudarium was then removed. Aloe and myrrh were placed on the cloth, and it was just set aside. So we talked earlier about the fact that if you had 23 points of coincidence between two images, that's considered to have come from the same source. Well, they compared the blood stains from the puncture wounds at the back of the neck between the sudarium and the shroud. They were in the same size and position. There were 70 points of coincidence between those blood stains. Both cloths covered someone who had been scourged, crowned with thorns, and crucified. But when the Romans were handing out sentences, depending upon the severity of your crime, you might be scourged, or you could be crucified. Of course, the Jews were screaming for Jesus to be crucified, and Pilate figured, well, maybe if I just scourge him and really mess up his body really bad, maybe they will stop asking for him to be crucified. So that's why he was scourged, but that didn't work. They still kept screaming for him to be crucified. So he was both scourged and crucified. And in all of human history, we only have one person who was ever scourged, crucified, and crowned with thorns. And of course, the reason they did that to Jesus is because they were making a mockery of him, being the King of the Jews. Even the facial characteristics match up between the shroud and the sudarium. The nose is 8 centimeters long. The right side of the nose is all swollen. The nose is displaced off to the right. The right cheek is completely bloody. Even the position and the size of the mouth, the chin, and even the shape of the beard match between both cloths. And even the soil samples that are detected around the nose there on the sudarium match the soil samples from the shroud. So the scientists there in Spain concluded that the sudarium had to have covered the head of the same man whose image and blood stains are on the shroud. I'd like to now switch to the tunic of Argenteuil. Argenteuil is a suburb of Paris. It's just north of Paris. I have a replica here of this tunic, this seamless garment that's referred to in Scripture. So you can see how it's taken out for veneration. And, right there, you can see the knights here protecting it. So it's the seamless garment referred to in Scripture. It has lots of blood stains on it. It's made out of a very fine sheep wool, and it's 1.2 by 1.1 meters in size. Does anyone care to venture a guess as to what these white areas are that we see on this tunic? Somebody just said it. Moths, yes. For 2,000 years, moths have had a feast on this woolen garment and have eaten all these holes in it, okay? Of course, we know when Jesus is there on the cross, he utters these words, my God, why have you forsaken me? Well, if I say to you, Our Father, I think the words of that prayer would come to your mind. If I say Hail Mary, I believe the words of that prayer would come to your mind. Well, the Jewish people had all the Psalms memorized. And these are the first words of Psalm 22. So when Jesus utters these words, all the Jewish people there would suddenly, in their minds, would bring in Psalm 22, which describes the crucifixion scene that's going on right there before their very eyes. So they're seeing the fulfillment of the prophecy of Psalm 22 right there. I'm going to skip all the way down to verse 18 not because it's any more important than any other part of Psalm 22, because it's probably far less important, but it relates to the tunic we're talking about here, because in verse 18, they divided my garments among them, and they cast lots for my tunic. And of course, we then see in the Gospel of John that when the soldiers were crucifying Jesus, they took his clothes, divided them into 4 shares, and with the undergarment, they said, this garment is seamless. Let's not tear it. Let's decide by lot who will get it. So that's the fulfillment of verse 18 within Psalm 22. I have a well-defined history on this, going all the way back to when St. Helena discovered it. We know it was in Constantinople at one point in time. Charlemagne had it at one point. He gave it to a nunnery where he had a sister and daughter that were nuns there. It was placed in a hole in a wall for protection at one point, just like this shroud itself was holed up in the wall. Lots of miracles associated with it. At one point in time, the Protestant Huguenots were going into the churches, and they were taking all the relics and destroying the relics. They were digging up the bodies of the saints and destroying those bodies. At this point in time, Abbot Lucas had responsibility for this tunic, and he refused to disclose its